Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 31 of our Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam Canto 6. And today we are beginning chapter 17. This chapter is titled Mother Parvati Curses Chitraketu. And the idea behind it is that this is how Chitraketu becomes Vritrasura. Yes, if you remember the story of Vritrasura, I'm sure. What a story. So, in his previous life, he was Chitraketu, who was a devotee. In fact, he was a great devotee, really. But anyway, somehow or other he got cursed by Mother Parvati, and that's what we're going to read about today. But first of all, devotees, let us chant our prayers. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastyatya Deshatarane Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Right, so in this chapter there's 41 verses, which we've divided into 6 sections as follows. First section is from verse 1 to verse 3, and we call that Chitraketu Travels Around the Universe. Then the second situation is from verse 4 to verse 9. Chitraketu laughs at and criticizes Lord Shiva. And then third section from verse 10 to verse 15, Parvati curses Chitraketu. Then fourth section from verse 16 to verse 24, Chitraketu responds to Parvati's curse. Then the fifth section, verse 25 to verse 35, Lord Shiva explains the elevated position of Chitraketu. Then the sixth section, from verse 36 to verse 41, Shukadev explains how Chitraketu accepted the curse. I'm just going to change my glasses. The ones I had on a moment ago are more suitable. Right, okay. So there you go, devotees. Mother Parvati, chapter 17, Mother Parvati curses Chitraketu. Yes, right, okay, so let's get into it now. The first section, verse 1 to verse 3, Chitraketu travels around the universe. Right, so verse 1, Srila Shukadev Goswami said, after offering obeisances to the direction from which Ananta, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, had disappeared, Chitraketu began traveling in outer space as the head of the Vidyadharas. Yes, he became the head of the Vidyadharas due to that was the first installation of mercy from chanting the mantra given to him by Narada Muni. And verses 2 and 3, being praised by great sages and saints, and by the inhabitants of Siddhaloka and Charanaloka, Chitraketu, the most powerful mystic, wandered about enjoying life for millions of years. With bodily strength and senses free from deterioration, he traveled within the valleys of Sumeru mountain, which is the place of perfection for various kinds of mystic power. In those valleys, he enjoyed life with the women of Vidyadhara Loka by chanting the glories of the Supreme Lord, Hari. So there's a short purport here to these two verses. Prabhupada says, it is to be understood that Maharaj Chitraketu, although surrounded by beautiful women from Vidyadhara Loka, did not forget to glorify the Lord by chanting the holy name of the Lord. It has been proved in many places that one who is not contaminated by any material condition, who's a pure devotee engaged in chanting the glories of the Lord, should be understood to be perfect. So the second section, from verse 4 to verse 9, Chitraketu laughs at and criticizes Lord Shiva. This is really quite an incident, quite a pastime. So let's read through the verses first, and then we'll come back and read them again with their purports. So verses 4 and 5. One time while King Chitraketu was traveling in outer space on a brilliantly effulgent airplane given to him by Lord Vishnu, he saw Lord Shiva surrounded by siddhas and charanas. Lord Shiva was sitting in an assembly of great saintly persons and embracing Parvati on his lap with his arm. Chitraketu laughed loudly and spoke within the hearing of Parvati. Verse 6, Chitraketu said, Lord Shiva, the spiritual master of the general populace, is the best of all living entities who have accepted material bodies. He enunciates the system of religion. Yet how wonderful it is that he is embracing his wife Parvati in the midst of an assembly of great saintly persons. And he continues in verse 7, Lord Shiva, whose hair is matted on his head, has certainly undergone great austerities and penances. Indeed, he is the president in the assembly of strict followers of Vedic principles. Nonetheless, he is seated with his wife on his lap in the midst of saintly persons and is embracing her as if he were a shameless, ordinary human being. Verse 8. Ordinary conditioned persons generally embrace their wives and enjoy their company in solitary places. How wonderful it is that Lord Mahadev, although a great master of austerity, is embracing his wife openly in the midst of an assembly of great saints. Verse 9. Srila Shukadev Goswami continued, My dear king, after hearing Chitraketu's statement, Lord Shiva, the most powerful personality whose knowledge is fathomless, simply smiled and remained silent. And all the members of the assembly followed the Lord by not saying anything. Oh, Krishna, isn't this an amazing situation? Can you believe it? So let's go through it again with the purports also this time. So verses 4 and 5. One time while King Chitraketu was traveling in outer space on a brilliantly effulgent airplane given to him by Lord Vishnu, he saw Lord Shiva surrounded by siddhas and charanas. Lord Shiva was sitting in an assembly of great saintly persons and embracing Parvati on his lap with his arm. Chitraketu laughed loudly and spoke within the hearing of Parvati. So let's look at the purport here. Srila Prabhupada says that Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, and I'll just read the translation of the verse he quotes. The purport is that the Supreme Personality of Godhead wanted to bring Chitraketu to Vaikuntha Loka as soon as possible. The Lord's plan was that Chitraketu be cursed by Parvati to become Vritrasura, so that in his next life he could quickly return home back to Godhead. And Prabhupada makes the point there are many instances of devotees acting as demons and then being brought back to Godhead by the mercy of the Lord. So anyway, for Parvati to be embraced by Lord Shiva is natural in the relationship between husband and wife. So there was nothing extraordinary there for Chitraketu to see. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, nonetheless, Chitraketu laughed loudly to see Lord Shiva in that situation, even though he should not have done so. Thus he was eventually cursed, and this curse was the cause of his returning home back to Godhead. Verse 6, Chitraketu said, Lord Shiva, the spiritual master of the general populace, is the best of all living entities who have accepted material bodies. He enunciates the system of religion. Yet how wonderful it is that he is embracing his wife Parvati in the midst of an assembly of great saintly persons. Verse 7, Lord Shiva, whose hair is matted on his head, has certainly undergone great austerities and penances. Indeed, he is the president in the assembly of strict followers of Vedic principles. Nonetheless, he's seated with his wife on his lap in the midst of saintly persons and is embracing her as if he were a shameless, ordinary human being. So Srila Prabhupada gives a short purport. I'll just read through it. Chitraketu appreciated the exalted position of Lord Shiva, and therefore he remarked at how wonderful it was that Lord Shiva was acting like an ordinary human being. He appreciated Lord Shiva's position, but when he saw Lord Shiva sitting in the midst of saintly persons and acting like a shameless ordinary man, he was astonished. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur remarks that although Chitraketu criticized Lord Shiva, he did not offend Lord Shiva like Daksha. Daksha considered Lord Shiva insignificant, but Chitraketu expressed his wonder at Lord Shiva's being situated in that way. Yes, because Lord Shiva is such a great personality. It seems so unusual, and he can sort of scarcely believe that Lord Shiva would do such a thing, whereas Daksha was saying that Lord Shiva is no good in different ways. Verse 8, ordinary conditioned persons generally embrace their wives and enjoy their company in solitary places. How wonderful it is that Lord Mahadev, although a great master of austerity, is embracing his wife openly in the midst of an assembly of great saints. And Prabhupada says, The word Mahavrata indicates a brahmachari who has never fallen down. Lord Shiva is counted amongst the best of yogis, yet he embraced his wife in the midst of great saintly persons. Chitraketu appreciated how great Lord Shiva was to be unaffected even in that situation. Therefore, Chitraketu was not an offender. He merely expressed his wonder. So now we'll go on to verse 9. Srila Shukadev Goswami continued, "My dear king, after hearing Chitraketu's statement, Lord Shiva, the most powerful personality whose knowledge is fathomless, simply smiled and remained silent. And all the members of the assembly followed the Lord by not saying anything." So, Srila Prabhupada in the purport says, Chitraketu's purpose in criticizing Lord Shiva is somewhat mysterious, can't be understood by common people. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur makes the following observations, that Lord Shiva is so powerful he can do what he likes. Although he was externally acting like an ordinary person and not following etiquette, this doesn't diminish his exalted position. The problem is that common men may follow his example. And Prabhupada refers to Bhagavad Gita chapter 3 verse 21, famous verse, Yad yad acharati shrestas, tat tad eve turojana, sayat pramanam kurute, lokas tad anuvartate. Whatever action a great man performs, common men follow, and whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. So a common man might also criticize Lord Shiva like Daksha, who got consequences for doing so, means really criticizing him, and not as here in the case of Chitraketu, expressing his surprise, his appreciation actually of Lord Shiva, and his surprise that he might do something like this. So actually, King Chitraketu was hoping that Lord Shiva would stop doing this, so that others might be saved from criticizing him and thus becoming truly offenders. So bearing this in mind, Chitraketu was somewhat harsh in his behavior with Lord Shiva. And the second paragraph, so Lord Shiva, who's very deep in knowledge, he could understand Chitraketu's purpose. So he wasn't angry, he just smiled and stayed silent. And the other members of the assembly, they also understood, so they did the same. They didn't protest. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, if the members of the assembly thought that Chitraketu had blasphemed Lord Shiva, they would certainly have left at once, blocking their ears with their hands. Yes, okay, so now section 3, from verse 10 to verse 15, Parvati curses Chitraketu. Right, let us read the verses as we did last time, and then we'll come back. Verse 10, not knowing the prowess of Lord Shiva and Parvati, Chitraketu strongly criticized them. His statements were not at all pleasing, and therefore the goddess Parvati, being very angry, spoke as follows to Chitraketu, who thought himself better than Lord Shiva in controlling the senses. Verse 11, the goddess Parvati said, alas, has this upstart now received a post from which to punish shameless persons like us? Has he been appointed ruler, carrier of the rod of punishment? Is he now the only master of everything? Verse 12, she continues, alas, Lord Brahma, who has taken his birth from the lotus flower, does not know the principles of religion, nor do the great saints like Bhrigu and Narada, nor the 4 Kumars headed by Sanat Kumar. Manu and Kapila have also forgotten the religious principles. I suppose it to be because of this that they have not tried to stop Lord Shiva from behaving improperly. Verse 13, she continues, this Chitraketu is the lowest of Kshatriyas, for he has impudently overridden Brahma and the other demigods by insulting Lord Shiva, upon whose lotus feet they always meditate. Lord Shiva is personified religion and the spiritual master of the entire world, and therefore Chitraketu must be punished. Verse 14, this person is puffed up because of his achievements, thinking, I am the best. He does not deserve to approach the shelter of Lord Vishnu's lotus feet, which are worshipped by all saintly persons, for he is impudent, thinking himself greatly important. Verse 15, O impudent one, my dear son, now take birth in a low, sinful family of demons, so that you will not commit such an offense again toward exalted, saintly persons in this world. Right, so let's go back and go through again with purports. Section 3, verse 10 to 15. Parvati curses Chitraketu. Verse 10. Not knowing the prowess of Lord Shiva and Parvati, Chitraketu strongly criticized them. His statements were not at all pleasing, and therefore the goddess Parvati, being very angry, spoke as follows to Chitraketu, who thought himself better than Lord Shiva in controlling the senses. Purport. So Prabhupada makes the point, although Chitraketu didn't mean to insult Lord Shiva, he shouldn't have criticized him, even though Shiva apparently was transgressing social customs. And Prabhupada refers to a Vedic aphorism, a very short sutra. Te jiyasam na doshaya. One who is very powerful should be understood to be faultless. For example, we shouldn't find fault with the sun, although it evaporates urine from the street. So, the most powerful people can't be criticized by ordinary people, or even by a great person. And so Chitraketu should have known that Shiva, although he's sitting like that, he should not have been criticized. The difficulty was that Chitraketu, he had become a great devotee of Lord Sankarshan, and he was a little proud at getting Sankarshan's favor. So he thought he could criticize anyone. So this kind of pride in a devotee is never tolerated. Vaishnav, of course, should always be very humble and should respect others. As Lord Chaitanya said, Trinadapi Sanichena Tarorapi Sahishnuna Amanina Manadena Kirtaniya Sadahari. One should chant the holy name of the Lord in a humble state of mind, thinking oneself lower than the straw in the street. One should be more tolerant than a tree, devoid of all sense of false prestige, and ready to offer all respect to others. In such a state of mind, one can chant the holy name of the Lord constantly. And as we say sometimes, only in that state of mind is it possible for one to chant the holy name of the Lord constantly. Otherwise, the mind will become deviated and we will follow the mind. So therefore, a Vaishnav, Prabhupada says, should never try to minimize another person's position. Better to remain humble and just chant Hare Krishna. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, the word nirjitat ma bimani ne indicates that Chitraketu thought himself a better controller of the senses than Lord Shiva, although actually he was not. Because of all these considerations, Mother Parvati was somewhat angry at Chitraketu. 11. The goddess Parvati said, alas, has this upstart now received a post from which to punish shameless persons like us? Has he been appointed ruler, carrier of the rod of punishment? Is he now the only master of everything? Verse 12. Alas, Lord Brahma, who has taken his birth from the lotus flower, does not know the principles of religion, nor do the great saints like Brigu and Narada, nor the 4 Kumars headed by Sanat Kumar. Manu and Kapila have also forgotten the religious principles. I suppose it to be because of this that they have not tried to stop Lord Shiva from behaving improperly. Verse 13. This Chitraketu is the lowest of Kshatriyas, for he has impudently overridden Brahma and the other demigods by insulting Lord Shiva, upon whose lotus feet they always meditate. Lord Shiva is personified religion and the spiritual master of the entire world, and therefore Chitraketu must be punished. And Prabhupada gives a very short purport. All the members of the assembly were exalted Brahmins and self-realized souls, but they did not say anything about the conduct of Lord Shiva, who was embracing the goddess Parvati on his lap. Chitraketu nonetheless criticized Lord Shiva, and therefore the opinion of Parvati was that he should be punished. Verse 14. This person is puffed up because of his achievements, thinking, I am the best. He does not deserve to approach the shelter of Lord Vishnu's lotus feet, which are worshipped by all saintly persons, for he is impudent, thinking himself greatly important. So Prabhupada comments, if a devotee thinks he's advanced in devotional service, he's considered puffed up, proud, and unfit to sit under the shelter of the lotus feet of the Lord. So again, Prabhupada quotes Lord Chaitanya's instruction, and he says, it's again applicable. Trinada pisuni chena, tarora pisa hishnuna, amanina manadena kirtaniya sadahari. One should chant the holy name of the Lord in a humble state of mind, thinking oneself lower than the straw in the street. One should be more tolerant than a tree, devoid of all sense of false prestige, and ready to offer all respect to others. In such a state of mind, one can chant the holy name of the Lord constantly. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, unless one is humble and meek, one cannot qualify to sit at the lotus feet of the Lord. In the Krishna book, where there's the description of the rasa dance, Srila Prabhupada makes the point, that the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he's very favorable to the devotees. They're very dear to him. And the Lord can tolerate in any offense, practically any offense, or mistake or foolishness, which a devotee may do. But, Prabhupada says, the Lord cannot tolerate pride. He can never tolerate pride. Because the situation is that we are all we're simply where we are in Krishna consciousness or as members of Prabhupada's movement out of mercy. None of us can come up and say, yes, I'm so very qualified, it was only proper that they should have me as a member of ISKCON. Yeah, the Lord cannot tolerate such pride. And therefore he disappeared from the gopis in the rasa dance. Of course, we shouldn't think that the rasa dance, the gopis in the rasa dance were really just proud, like perhaps we may become sometimes. But the Lord created that situation to teach us this lesson. Verse 15, O impudent one, my dear son, now take birth in a low sinful family of demons, so that you will not commit such an offense again toward exalted saintly persons in this world. So the purport, Prabhupada again makes the point one should be very careful not to offend the lotus feet of Vaishnavas, and Lord Shiva is the best of the Vaishnavas. 12th canto, in the last chapter, there's a verse, I forget the verse number, but it says, Vaishnavanam yata Shambhu. Lord Shiva is the best of the devotees. And Lord Chaitanya told Srila Rupa Goswami that an offense to the Vaishnavas, or to the lotus feet of a Vaishnav, is hati mata. It's like a mad elephant. A mad elephant can destroy a garden. So similarly, if one becomes like a mad elephant and commits offenses at the lotus feet of a Vaishnav, his entire spiritual career is halted. So one should be very careful not to do so. Second paragraph. So Parvati was justified in punishing Chitraketu for criticizing such a great devotee. So Shiva is Mahadev, the father of the living entities in the material world. And Mother Parvati, or the goddess Durga, is called Mother. A pure Vaishnav, so a pure Vaishnav should be very careful to do his duties without criticizing others. This is the safest position. Otherwise, if you do, you may commit a great offense by somehow criticizing a Vaishnav. And third paragraph. So because Chitraketu was a Vaishnav, he might have been surprised that Parvati cursed him. Therefore she addresses him, as we read, as Putra, as son. Of course, everyone's a son of Durga, but she's not an ordinary mother. Yeah, but as soon as there's a slight discrepancy in a demon's behavior, Mother Durga immediately punishes him so he can come to his senses. Yeah. So anyway, Srila Prabhupada refers to Bhagavad Gita chapter 7 verse 14. Daivyesha gunamayi mama maya dharachaya mama eviye prapadyante mayam etam taranti te. Very important and famous verse. This divine energy of mine, consisting of the three modes of material nature, is difficult to overcome. But those who have surrendered unto me can easily cross beyond it. So, to surrender to Krishna, Prabhupada says, it also means to surrender to the devotees. You can't become like a proper servant of Krishna unless you're a proper servant of devotees. Prabhupada refers to a famous verse, Chadiya Vaishnava Seva, Nistara Payeche Keba. Without serving a servant of Krishna, one cannot be elevated to being a servant of Krishna himself. Sometimes that line, Charya Vaishnav Seva Nistara Payachikeva. Sometimes it's translated that no one has become a devotee without serving the devotees. Yeah. So she's speaking to him like a mother speaking to a naughty child, referring to him as son, addressing him as son. And she's saying, I'm punishing you so you won't do anything like this again in the future. And Prabhupada makes the point, this sort of activity or tendency is found in Mother Yashoda with Krishna. And because in the Damodar Leela, of course, she punished him by tying him up. She showed him a stick and sort of waved the stick in his direction. Because it's the duty of a mother to chastise her beloved son, even in the case of the Lord. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, it is to be understood that Mother Durga was justified in punishing Chitraketu. This punishment was a boon to Chitraketu, because after taking his birth as the demon Vritrasura, he was promoted directly to Vaikuntha. As we already read that back in chapter 11 and around about there. So, okay. So now we come to the fourth section, verse 16 to verse 24. Chitraketu responds to Parvati's curse. Yes, so we will read through the verses here, verse 16 to verse 24. 16, Sri Shukadev Goswami continued, My dear King Parikshit, when Chitraketu was cursed by Parvati, he descended from his airplane, bowed before her with great humility, and pleased her completely. 17, Chitraketu said, My dear mother, with my own hands folded together, I accept the curse upon me. I do not mind the curse, for happiness and distress are given by the demigods as a result of one's past deeds. Yes, okay, so verse 18. Deluded by ignorance, the living entity wanders in the forest of this material world, enjoying the happiness and distress resulting from his past deeds, everywhere and at all times. And then Prabhupada puts in brackets, as sort of like, a comment or afterthought. Therefore, my dear mother, neither you nor I am to be blamed for this incident. Verse 19, in this material world, neither the living entity himself nor others, friends and enemies, are the cause of material happiness and distress. But because of gross ignorance, the living entity thinks that he and others are the cause. Verse 20. This material world resembles the waves of a constantly flowing river. Therefore, what is a curse and what is a favor? What are the heavenly planets and what are the hellish planets? What is actually happiness and what is actually distress? Because the waves flow constantly, none of them has an eternal effect. 21. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is one, unaffected by the conditions of the material world. So unaffected by the conditions of the material world, he creates all the conditioned souls by his own personal potency. Because of being contaminated by the material energy, the living entity is put into ignorance and thus into different conditions of bondage. Sometimes by knowledge, the living entity is given liberation. In Sattva-gun and Rajagun, he is subjected to happiness and distress. 22. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is equally disposed toward all living entities. Therefore, no one is very dear to him, and no one is a great enemy for him. No one is his friend, and no one is his relative. Being unattached to the material world, he has no affection for so-called happiness or hatred for so-called distress. The two terms, happiness and distress, are relative. Since the Lord is always happy, for him there is no question of distress. Verse 23. Although the Supreme Lord is unattached to our happiness and distress according to karma, and although no one is his enemy or favorite, he creates pious and impious activities through the agency of his material potency. Thus, for the continuation of the materialistic way of life, he creates happiness and distress, good fortune and bad, bondage and liberation, birth and death. Verse 24. O Mother, you are now unnecessarily angry. But since all my happiness and distress are destined by my past activities, I do not plead to be excused or relieved from your curse. Although what I have said is not wrong, please let whatever you think is wrong be pardoned. Wow, what an interesting part of the Bhagavatam. So it's section 4, verse 16 to 24. Chitraketu responds to Parvati's curse. 16. Sri Shukadev Goswami continued, My dear King Parikshit, when Chitraketu was cursed by Parvati, he descended from his airplane, bowed before her with great humility, and pleased her completely. 17. Chitraketu said, My dear mother, with my own hands folded together, I accept the curse upon me. I do not mind the curse, for happiness and distress are given by the demigods as a result of one's past deeds. Yes, so purport. So we see here in this section how Chitraketu, because he was a devotee, wasn't disturbed by the curse. He knew people suffer, enjoy the results of their past deeds as ordained by Daiva Netrena, the superior authority or agents of the Lord. He knew he hadn't really committed an offense, but still punishment was ordained by her, and he's a devotee, and a devotee is so meek and humble. He accepts any condition of life as a blessing from the Lord. Prabhupada refers to Bhagavatam 10:14-8, famous verse, which basically says that one should carry on glorifying the Lord, carrying on serving the Lord, and accepting whatever comes to one due to one's past activities, not protesting. And if you do like that, then the kingdom of God becomes your rightful inheritance. Just like a child inherits from the father or from the parents, because it's just a natural right. It's just a natural right. So it's just a natural right that a devotee who carries on in devotional service despite challenges of different types, praying to the Lord very humbly for mercy, And yes, just being very gentle and humble. It's natural that the devotee will go back to Godhead. So if we live like this, well, Prabhupada says a devotee always accepts punishment from anyone as the Lord's mercy. And if we live like this, then we'll see any reverse as being due to our past misdeeds. So a devotee never accuses anyone. On the contrary, the devotee becomes more attached to the Lord because of being purified by that suffering. So suffering is a process of purification. Actually, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta makes the point that as gold is purified by fire, I don't know if you've ever seen raw gold as it's come out of the ground, particularly from deep under the ground. It comes up and it doesn't look like gold at all. It's black. It looks pretty much like coal, but then it's processed by fire, and then it shows itself to be gold. Yes, okay. So yeah, as gold is purified by fire, so the devotee is purified by the fire of ordeal. So second paragraph, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that one who has developed Krishna consciousness and loves Krishna is not subject to suffering and happiness under karma. He is beyond karma. And Brahma Samhita says, verse 54, Karmani nirdahati kintu cha bhakti bhajam. A devotee is free from the reactions of his karma because he's taken to devotional service. So Bhagavad Gita chapter 14 verse 26 confirms this. Sagunan samatityaitan brahma bhuya kalpate. One who's engaged in devotional service has already been freed from the reactions of his material karma, and thus he immediately becomes Brahma Bhuta, or transcendental. So Bhagavatam 1-21 also expresses this. Kshiyante chasya karamani. Before attaining the stage of love, one becomes free from all the results of karma. So third paragraph. Of course, the Lord is very kind to his devotees. So the devotee under any condition is not subject to karma. Devotee never aspires for heavenly planets. And even the heavenly planets, liberation, hell, they're non-different for the devotee. Devotee doesn't discriminate between different positions in this world. But of course the devotee is always eager to go back to Godhead and stay there with the Lord. And this ambition becomes stronger and stronger. So as that happens, the devotee doesn't care about material changes in his life. So Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur makes the point that Parvati's curse should be considered the mercy of the Lord. The Lord wanted Chitraketu to come back to Godhead as soon as possible, so he just terminated all the reactions to his past deeds. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, acting through the heart of Parvati, the Lord who's situated in everyone's heart, cursed Chitraketu in order to end all his material reactions. Thus Chitraketu became Vritrasura in his next life and returned home back to Godhead. Verse 18. Deluded by ignorance, the living entity wanders in the forest of this material world. enjoying the happiness and distress resulting from his past deeds everywhere and at all times. And then Prabhupada puts in brackets, it's like a little comment, therefore, my dear mother, neither you nor I am to be blamed for this incident. And Prabhupada refers to Bhagavad Gita chapter 3, verse 27. I'll just read the translation. The bewildered soul under the influence of the three modes of material nature thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by nature. But unfortunately, the conditioned souls are completely under the control of the material nature, wandering here and there, just getting the results of their activities one after the other. It's all going on by the Lord's laws of material nature. But still the conditioned soul thinks he's the doer, but he's not. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, to get free from the karma chakra, the wheel of the results of one's karma, one should take to the Bhakti marg, devotional service or Krishna consciousness. That is the only remedy. Sarva dharman parityajya mam ekam sharanam vraja. That, of course, is Bhagavad Gita 1866. Verse 19. In this material world, neither the living entity himself nor others, friends and enemies, are the cause of material happiness and distress. But because of gross ignorance, the living entity thinks that he and others are the cause. So Prabhupada comments that here the word agya is important. It means ignorant. In this material world, all living entities are agya, ignorant, to different degrees. Yeah, the mode of, well, that ignorance is very strong in the mode of ignorance. So one has to promote oneself to goodness through character and behavior, and then gradually come to the transcendental level, the adhokshaja level, where he realizes his position and others' positions. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, everything is done under the superintendence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The process by which the results of action are ordained is called niyatam, always working. Verse 20. This material world resembles the waves of a constantly flowing river. Therefore, what is a curse and what is a favor? What are the heavenly planets and what are the hellish planets? What is actually happiness and what is actually distress? Because the waves flow constantly, none of them has an eternal effect. So Prabhupada again quotes from the song which I mentioned just some little while ago, today I think it was. Yeah. The song's called Radha Krishna Bol Bol Bolare Sabai. So here Prabhupada quotes, Mitche Maira Vashe Yacha Beche Kacha Habadubu Bai. My dear living entities within this material world, why are you being carried away by the waves of the modes of material nature? Jiv Krishna Dasa Evishvasa Kale Tara Dukanai. If the living entity comes to understand that he's the eternal servant, that he's an eternal servant of Krishna, there will no longer be misery for him. So Krishna wants us to give up everything, surrender to him. And then, if we do that, where will the phenomenon of cause and effect in this material world be? There'll be no cause and effect for us in terms of karma. Yeah. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that being put in the material world is like being put in a salt mine. if you're in a salt mine, you taste salt wherever you go. And salt is not nice. I mean, if you just eat salt, it's really not nice. So similarly, this material world is full of miseries. Even the so-called temporary happiness is misery. But in ignorance, we don't understand this. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, that is the actual position. When one comes to his senses, when he becomes Krishna conscious, he's no longer concerned with the various conditions of this material world. He's not concerned with happiness or distress, curses or favors, or heavenly or hellish planets. He sees no distinction between them. Verse 21. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is one. Unaffected by the conditions of the material world, he creates all the conditioned souls by his own personal potency. Because of being contaminated by the material energy, the living entity is put into ignorance and thus into different conditions of bondage. Sometimes by knowledge, the living entity is given liberation. In Sattvagun and Rajagun, he is subjected to happiness and distress. Yes, so Srila Prabhupada says, the question can be raised, why the living entities are in different conditions, and who's arranged this? The answer is, it's done by the Lord, with no one else's help. He has his own energies, and one of them, material energy, creates the material world with its varieties of happiness and distress for the conditioned souls, all under his supervision. And this material world consists of the three modes. The Lord maintains it through Sattvagun, creates it through Rajagun, and annihilates it through Tamagun, ignorance. And after the varieties of living entities are created, they're subject to happiness and distress according to their association. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, when they're in Sattvagun, the mode of goodness, they feel happiness. When in Rajagun, they're distressed. And when in Tamagun, they have no sense of what to do or what is right and what is wrong. Hare Krishna. We will carry on tomorrow with verse 22. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.